Speaker's going to speak now. Here we go. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to change gears a little bit, and the reason is because Washington traffic. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring our closing short speaker, Ira Forman, in to speak, and then we're going to close off with our panel. So it's all going to happen in rapid-fire succession. Good afternoon, everyone. Reading from my prepared remarks. I hope you will agree it has been quite a day. As director of the Center for Jewish Civilization, it is my pleasure to introduce our dear and distinguished colleague, Ira Forman, who will deliver some concluding thoughts on what you heard today about the conference. Ira Forman is a senior fellow on anti-Semitism at the Center for Jewish Civilization and a senior fellow at the Moment Institute. In the fall of 2018, he was appointed senior advisor on anti-Semitism and Human Rights at Human Rights First. Mr. Forman served as the State Department's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism from 2013 to 2017. From 2011 to 2012, he served as the Jewish Outreach Director for the Obama for America campaign. He also served for nearly 15 years as the Executive Director of the National Jewish Democratic Council. He received his BA from Harvard University, where he graduated magna cum laude in government. He received his MBA from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, and he co-edited and wrote for the reference book Jews and American Politics. We're very, very lucky because he's been taking notes all day, except he hasn't taken notes on the final panel because the final panel hasn't happened yet. So we're just going to reverse the order. We thank him for doing a little jazz improvisation with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ira Forman.
Well, Jacques, thank you for that overly generous introduction. Although, didn't they give you my elementary school awards in that bio? They're really nice. The next time if you could do that, it'd be great. So anyway, when I was trained 40 years ago on public speaking, I had one lesson on public speaking. One of the things they told you about 2 or 3 things you never do, and one of them is to start off with an apology. But I'm going to do it anyway. And the apology is, white nationalism is not exactly my wheelhouse. I have been spending the last 6 years on anti-Semitism, and particularly as the special envoy in anti-Semitism at the State Department, we don't deal with anti-Semitism in the United States, and certainly not white supremacy. Now, I tried to follow it in the last few years, particularly since being at Georgetown, working for Human Rights First. But as I said, this is not exactly my wheelhouse, and I've learned a lot actually today. But let me try to generalize a little bit from anti-Semitism to the larger issues of discrimination, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, etc., anti-immigration. And let me step back just one second and say, though we'll try to generalize, certainly each of these discriminations, each of these prejudices, biases, are very different phenomena. And we heard from our panel earlier today that with anti-Semitism, it's not that you look down on Jews particularly, in some ways you do, but the Jews are the mastermind, the puppet masters. It's a very different way of looking at a certain type of prejudice. And these have some unique characteristics. You have to deal with them uniquely. But having said that, there is enough commonality that I think I'll try to generalize. And the first is, I think, the concept that we're using history. We're looking back at National Socialism, Nazism, to see what can we learn from that. I think it's incredibly important here for 2 reasons. One, we can't really get a perspective like how bad are things unless you do two things. One is you look at what's happened in the past. But also the other thing is you look at what's happening in different places in the world. And certainly with anti-Semitism, very, very different types of anti-Semitism. You have this growth of anti-Semitism around the world, but dramatically different types. So you can't get a handle without looking at history. And I think that's been very helpful for me today to be dealing with some of these issues. Now, the second reason, of course, is can we learn from historical mistakes? Can we learn from the Weimar Republic of what kind of threats these really are? Because if you ask me today, is anti-Semitism the type of threat it was in the 30s? I tell you no, not at all. I can find similarities, but very different. But by the same token, what I know is it morphs very quickly. And if we don't start trying to look at those historical mistakes we made, we'll be in deep trouble. So the next thing I think in terms of thoughts about today is complexity. It's great to have it's really important to have this information out here because these are very, very complex phenomena. It's the thing that shocked me most in working with the State Department, of understanding the complexity of anti-Semitism. So, for example, just a quick example, one of the great human rights triumphs of the last century certainly was the Soviet Jewry movement. And if in the 60s when it started, if you had said, you know, in 20 years, 30 years, the Soviet Union would let this huge ethnic group go, this was an amazing thing that was, especially in the wake of the failures in the Holocaust, an amazing, amazing job. But as difficult as that is, I think it pales compared to what we face today in terms of anti-Semitism, because rather than dealing with really one country, we're dealing with literally dozens of countries where we have serious anti-Semitic problems. And again, they're usually connected to other racial and other types of biases as well. And in addition that it's dozens of countries instead of one, in Soviet Jewry we had one address we could go to fix the problem, Kremlin. If you went to the Kremlin, they could fix the problem. I can't tell you in any one of those 20-some countries that I look at that there's one place to go. There's always multiple places to go. So the complexity is very important. And I can give you some examples. The other thing about the complexity is there are no silver bullets here to fix the problem. If you go to an anti-Semitism conference, I have Mark Weitzman here who's gone to about 150 over the last few decades. He will tell you that there are some common threads. Like one is everybody talks about how do you deal with security. Everybody talks about education, the importance, but what kind of education? Certainly just teaching the Holocaust doesn't necessarily have anything to do with fixing anti-Semitism. We heard that today about people saying, what is the value? This might as well be the Middle Ages, you're teaching history. Unless you can make younger people understand how this affects their lives, that education is not going to work. Obviously, there are legislative remedies. There's obviously the importance of political figures speaking out, whether it's on racism, whether it's on anti-Semitism, et cetera, Islamophobia. But then there's also the question of this is a very hard phenomenon to compartmentalize. We like to think of this of right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, and then finally, the anti-Semitism you find in some extreme Islamic groups such as ISIS, et cetera. But they're all connected. I just talked to a leading British Jewish community leader who told me, we are seeing among left-wing blogs, Corbyn's people, we are seeing now classic right-wing anti-Semitism, not like, anti-colonial, Israel is an apartheid state, Israel is a genocidal state. What we're seeing is the Rothschilds and Soros are running the world. And you're seeing it on left-wing blogs. And they're literally pulling it off right-wing blogs. You see the anti-Semitic caricatures, which are classic Nazi, etc. That is now showing up on extreme left-wing blogs. So it's important to compartmentalize. We learn a lot. And it's important to look and find what the sources are. But they're also beginning to, in many places, to trade among each other. So these are all things we must do. What must we not do? And I think that's an important thing in today's society. You saw it yesterday in the hearings on the Hill on white nationalism. It's everything in this society has become tribal and politicized. Anti-Semitism has been, and other forms of this type of discrimination, this is motherhood and apple pie. It's like everybody agrees, not now. Increasingly, people are using these things as a weapon, a political weapon, against the other side. So if you say you're against anti-Semitism, but the only anti-Semitism you can talk about is the anti-Semitism on your opponent's side and not on your own, and it certainly is on your own, whether you're left or right, then you don't care about anti-Semitism. You care about using this as a political weapon. This is as dangerous a problem for all types of discrimination. And we saw it yesterday on the Hill in the white nationalist hearings. So let me end really quickly with a story. I went after the riots in 2014 to France, after the riots in the wake of the Gaza war, because there were all these stories of French Jewry ending, that they were going to be leaving in mass numbers, and the numbers did go up because there were attacks all throughout Europe, not just French Jews. And I asked the question in a luncheon with Jewish leaders, and a young man got up and said, everybody I know is leaving. Everybody says they're leaving. But ultimately they won't, even if it gets worse. It's just too difficult to do. But our kids are getting beat up in schools. We pull them out of our public schools and put them in a Jewish school, they get hit by terrorists. You pull them, right now, 1/3 of our children go to Catholic schools because it's the safest alternative. And he went on through this whole litany of all the problems of the community that will stay, but what will damage be done? And then he ended in saying, look, the government has been great. There's nothing more we can ask for. But civil society, we don't know if they'll be with us. And then he said, and I think this gets to our next panel, this is not about Jews. We may be the first to feel this. We will not be the last. This is about the very values of the French Republic. This is about democracy. This is about the ability of democracy to survive in the 21st century. And if we don't understand it, we're not taking this seriously enough. Thank you.